The United Nations has proclaimed May 22nd the International Day of Biological Diversity. This is to increase awareness and understanding of issues surrounding biological diversity. We at Green Anglicans Movement have not been left behind, and that's why we have an expert with us to discuss issues surrounding biological diversity in simple terms. Stay tuned. All right, so here with me is Nicholas Pande. He is from CAPA. He's an agronomist. So what do you do at CAPA?
At CAPA, I lead the council's work on environmental stewardship, on food security and disaster resilience and response.
So recently, I asked somebody about what they understand of biological diversity, and they told me it could be something about gender. So what is biological diversity in simple terms?
I must say that was a very interesting response. But biological diversity, as we call it, is just the variety of life on Earth. We are just saying that the Earth supports many lives, and these lives are human lives, are plant lives, are animal lives, are the lives of the bacteria and the fungi. So that all life, every living organism constitutes what we call biological diversity.
So Nicholas, tell us a practical illustration of how diverse biological diversity is.
I would say that quite diverse life on Earth. Life on Earth is quite diverse, that the estimates from the scientists will say that we've got around 7.8 million species of plants and animals. Not all documented. We have currently only around 1.2 million species that have been documented. So it's quite a diverse world with many living organisms, and that these living organisms exist in ecosystems. So maybe you are talking about an illustration of diversity, mostly looking at the context of ecosystems, because ecosystems is just a place where different organisms coexist, and it is particularly adapted to them, like aquatic ecosystem, that is water in life. I mean life in water. So everything that lives in water, we call that an aquatic ecosystem. But we've got also those organisms, plant and animals, that do well in rainforests or tropical rainforests. And there are those that are in grasslands. So those are ecosystems. So when we talk about biodiversity, we are talking about how many plants and animals, fungi and bacteria live in a particular ecosystem or in a particular place, and how they coexist, supporting each other's life. Plants supporting lives of animals, and animals supporting lives of plants.
So we are marking International Day of Biological Diversity today, May 22nd. So why the concern over biological diversity?
Yeah, biological diversity, and I'm so glad that we are talking about biological diversity now, because biological diversity should be a subject of interest to all of us. The fact that God in His wisdom and in His power put such varied life on Earth, and that it was not by mistake, and that it is something we need to appreciate. It is important because in life, our lives are connected to each other. And this is not just human life, because in Africa we talk of Ubuntu, of you are because I am because you are. That Ubuntu philosophy so much needs to be reflected in our relationship with other creations, because we are because the plants are. The plants are because we are. Interestingly, plants can actually exist without humans. But for humans, it should be such a concern, because it will be difficult to live without the plants and the animals in which we depend for food. So biodiversity is so important that we need to be aware of that diversity and how it supports our life, and to talk about it. And at this particular time, I think it's more important because we are experiencing a lot of biodiversity loss. Actually, statistically speaking, it is estimated that by next century, we'll have lost 50% of biodiversity we have currently. In Africa, we are talking about losing 50% of birds and mammal life, and around 20 to 30% of the lake productivity. And that's a threat to human life. But just before even speaking into how it threatens human life, this loss that we are seeing and is being estimated is not just happening naturally. It is attributed to our activities as humans. That human activity is interfering with biodiversity. And some of these activities or these factors that are affecting biodiversity are things like pollution. Pollution is hugely a human activity. And that we've got activities such that we either are polluting, especially maybe just singling out marine pollution, where we discharge toxic chemicals or effluents into water bodies. These toxic chemicals interfere with marine life. They kill the living organisms in there. Recently, we've just experienced in Kenya fish death, massive death of fish in Lake Naivasha. That means that that environment, that ecosystem was interfered with by human activity. We have a lot of pollution also, plastic pollution going into these water bodies. And so you end up with a lot of plastics that are interfering with the normal life of those organisms in water. But besides pollution, we are also experiencing high population growth. High population growth has also contributed to loss of biodiversity in many ways. One of it is that we are now clearing more forests to settle. It means that the animals that used to live there are going extinct. Like in my village, some 20 years ago, there were quails. Quails were just there. We used to go hunt them in the forest. But currently there are no quails in my village, because it's now all built environment. So we've cleared those places to settle. But again, the increased population means that there is higher demand for food. And this higher demand for food is now, I would say it's also now coupled with capitalism, which is very interesting. That you have 4.7 million people in Nairobi you want to feed on chicken. But naturally, in biodiversity, you've got the local chicken, the indigenous chicken, which will take up to 6 to 8 months to get to any weight that you would want to eat. And so what does this mean? It means that we are now more manipulative of the animals. You now want the chicken that can mature within 6 weeks. And so we are moving away from the natural foods and their own lifespans and life cycles, and now manipulating. Because we want to produce more food, now we are manipulating how a chicken grows. We feed it, we manipulate its genetics first, and then it's feeding, so that within 6 weeks you've got something to eat. And because you want to make money, you want to do that more. Even the layers, currently I had a friend who was asking me how he can get a chicken that like lays 2 eggs per day. And so that I just asked myself, of course, the indigenous chicken we have do not do that. And that tells me that people want more. So they want to squeeze everything out of animals. But also that population growth, even in plant production, we see it a lot. There is now a lot of foliar feeding to vegetables, just so that the vegetables can mature faster. But again, you see it in terms of how we are moving into the environment. We are mostly also people going into, especially in the rural areas, going into the wildlife to just hunt. Of course, those have been some of traditional ways. But that all that affects that diversity. And that, especially in urban population, we lose diversity, especially even of foods, because we now have embraced more exotically bred plants and animals. I've talked about the kind of chicken we eat, the kind of vegetables we want. So we are not appreciating much of what we will call the indigenous vegetables. So as you don't cultivate them, you don't eat them, they go extinct. So you don't have them anymore. But besides, again, population growth, you've got climate change. Climate change is impacting biodiversity. We might not have keenly looked at how things happen. But if you look at some of what we call biodiversity hotspots are those areas that support enormous biodiversity. They are environments or ecosystems that supports a lot of biological diversity. You've got so many organisms existing in that particular place. In Africa, we've got South Africa and Madagascar, which are biodiversity hotspots. They support so much life. And that is only possible because they've got ideal environmental conditions. So when climate change comes, climate change alters that ideal environmental condition. You are now having warmer areas. It means that any organism that is not able to be supported by warmer environment goes extinct. You've got now a lot of flooding and many things. And we know that just 2 years ago, I think it's late 2019, that out of climate change, you have all these wild fires, and that Australia experienced a wildfire. This wildfire took away 500 million animals. You can imagine where in an environment or in a country or whatever we'll call it, that you lose 500 million animals. Why? Because there was a wildfire. Why was there a wildfire? Much of what we do that has brought about climate change. So when we are looking at climate change, we're seeing like what are the kind of risks that come with it. It comes with floods, it comes with fires, it comes with very bad conditions for ecosystems. And so that's why we talk of how climate change affects biodiversity. But in Africa, I won't mention all the kind of factors responsible for losses. But in Africa, I can't fail to talk about the conflict. Sometimes you experience conflicts, and especially armed conflict. That in Africa, you've got conflict has made people, especially the combatants, the rebels and all those other groups. We are talking about Congo, we are talking about South Sudan, we are talking about Central African Republic, Angola. You have people who have gone into protected areas because most of these people fight from the forests. Forests are protected areas for those particular ecosystems. I mean, the organisms that have their life, that as their natural habitat. So because, and the estimations are that you have had up to 70% of protected areas invaded. That's between maybe 1946 and 2010. That you've had humans now access those protected areas. And what happens when they go there? They hunt wildlife and they destroy forests there. But something again, so closely linked to that is the illicit trafficking of especially wildlife. And so you've had a lot of poaching happening. And we've seen, even the media has highlighted how these combatants and some of the warlords there are colluding with the illicit traffickers to poach wildlife. Elephants, rhinos, and some other animals with those parts that are commercialized have been much affected. Actually, in Kenya, in 2018, we lost Sudan. You know, Sudan was the last male northern white rhino standing, and it died. And so it just means that the species of northern white rhinos are going or is extinct. And that is hugely attributed to the trafficking, the poaching that has happened to those rhinos over years. So the world came to just realize that actually we are losing northern white rhinos and that the last male standing Sudan succumbed in 2018. So we're talking about how the biodiversity loss is both making some other lives, especially animal lives, extinct, that they were there but they are no longer there, including plants. And how again all these factors are contributing to that loss. And that loss is a concern. It's a concern because it affects human life. It affects the food we'll eat because you're losing that diversity. You are slashing everywhere. And so the food insecurities will increase there. The benefits we get, medicinal value we get from forests. When you are clearing forests, it means that much of our medicine is actually a benefit from our forests. So some of the medicinal values of the plants that we experience currently, when we are talking about losing these organisms, 50% of this species in the next century, it means that at that point, some of the plants that we depend on right now for medicine will no longer be there. And for food, will no longer be there. And for many things that we benefit from by just coexisting between plants, humans, animals. So that is my reflection on how and the cost of biodiversity loss.
So we are marking a biological diversity, of course, and the theme for this year is we are part of the solution. So what advice would you give to everybody in general and Green Anglicans of what to do about biological diversity?
Yeah, I think it's a good question of action. That should we just sit and watch things deteriorate? Should we just say that, oh yeah, the scientists are estimating we are going to lose 50% of our organisms in the next century? Or what should, or are these just fairy tales? It's important for us as one, people of faith, and the public in general, because it's not only affecting us, people of faith, but as people of faith, it simply means that we've got a higher calling, the biblical mandate to steward the natural world, and that anyone needs to be concerned about this, because besides the threats that loss of biodiversity has to us, that we need to wake up and do something. And one of the things, as you mentioned, that our lifestyle in itself have just contributed maybe to diminishing of some of the biodiversity, and especially in terms of food. I mentioned about indigenous vegetables. So one of the ways to me is to appreciate biodiversity. How do you appreciate it? You just appreciate that it is not only humans that needs to live. Plants needs to be there, and animals needs to be there, and in their natural habitats. And so you appreciating that means that, one, you want to conserve those habitats. So if there are wetlands, then you need to conserve the wetlands. If there are forests, we need to conserve the forests. Whatever they are, that we need to conserve those natural habitats to support those lives. But again, appreciating it means that if it is something that we use, like for food, that we appreciate the diversity. Because currently, most of us seem to be stuck with a range of a few vegetable varieties, while we've got many indigenous varieties that we don't bring to our dining tables. So to me, appreciating biodiversity means that you eat kales, but you also eat what in Kenya we call managu, or the nightshade, the crotolarias, all those indigenous vegetables that we have. So that as we appreciate the exotically bred, we also appreciate much more what we have naturally around us. So you cultivate them. So in our farms, we don't just plant cabbages alone, but we plant those other indigenous vegetables. But again, as we've said, you conserve. But sometimes you find that there's a lot of loss, like the way we have the forest losses, wetlands. So there is also the opportunity to recover, so that you restore these habitats or these ecosystems so that they can support the natural life. So we can be involved in reclaiming these places, so that if it's a wetland, you can reclaim it and protect it. If there are forests, we can stop the human activities there, the felling of trees, the people encroaching, the farming in forests, so that we pull away from it and have it resume its natural order, so that it can support more life. And because when you are farming in a forest, the snakes will no longer be there, because you are burning everything. But when it's restored, it means that the snakes will be there. The other small organisms will be there. The baboons will be there. So we are not driving away and making extinct other organisms by encroaching these places. So we pull. You can restore by pulling and making things happen. So to me, it is important for us to, one, create awareness about the kind of loss we are experiencing currently with biodiversity, appreciate biodiversity, conserve the habitats that support biodiversity, and also possibly reclaim if there is loss.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for creating time to be with us. We do not take it for granted. Remember, dear viewer, follow us on all our platforms, on all our social media platforms, ask questions, interact with us, and continue to do the little things to care for Earth.